Laddies and gentlemen, welcome to Explore Everything. Today, we step inside the cold iron gates of Pentonville Prison, one of Britain's most notorious jailhouses. A fortress of discipline, secrecy, and rebellion, where daring escapes, violent riots, and chilling executions carved their place in British criminal history. This is not just a prison, it's a symbol of how justice, punishment, and power evolved through the centuries. Let's journey back to the early 19th century, to an age when London's streets were bursting with poverty, crime, and chaos. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain into the world's most powerful empire, but beneath that glory lay overcrowded slums, desperate workers, and a justice system struggling to control a rising tide of criminals. Prisons were filthy, disease-ridden hellholes, places where men, women, and children were crammed together, forgotten by society. It was out of this turmoil that a new idea was born. A radical experiment that would change the face of punishment forever. The British government decided to build a model prison, a symbol of discipline, morality, and reform. In 1842, on a cold stretch of land in North London, the gates of Pentonville Prison swung open for the first time. Pentonville was unlike any prison that came before it. It wasn't built to break bones. It was built to break the spirit of crime itself. The architects, under the direction of Colonel Joshua Jebb, designed it around the revolutionary concept known as the separate system. This system aimed not just to confine prisoners, but to reprogram their minds. Each inmate would live, eat, sleep, and work alone, in silence, cut off from every other soul. The idea was that isolation would force a criminal to confront his own conscience, to reflect, to repent. The prison's layout reflected this cold philosophy of control. At its heart stood a central watchtower, and from it stretched 5 long wings, radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. From that central point, a single officer could observe every corridor, every cell door, every movement. Surveillance wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Prisoners knew they were being watched, even when they couldn't see their watchers. That fear alone kept many in line. Inside the walls, everything was designed to strip away individuality. The cells were small, just 9 feet long and 6 feet wide, barely enough space to turn around. Each contained a simple bed, a wooden stool, a folding table, a Bible, and a small chamber pot. The thick brick walls muffled every sound so that one prisoner could not hear another's voice. For 23 hours a day, they were completely alone. No talking, no companionship, no laughter. Even during chapel services, prisoners sat in individual cubicles, separated by high wooden partitions so they couldn't see one another. It was a system born out of moral conviction, but carried out with chilling precision. Reformers of the time believed solitude could purify the soul. They thought silence was the key to redemption. But for many, it became a silent form of torture. Inmates began to lose their minds in the endless quiet. Some spoke to themselves just to hear a voice. Others carved messages into the walls or scratched their names into the stone, desperate for proof that they still existed. Pentonville's construction also marked a turning point in how Britain viewed punishment. For centuries, criminals had been publicly flogged, branded, or hanged in the open square. Punishment meant spectacle. But Pentonville changed that. Justice moved behind closed doors. Discipline became private, calculated, and psychological. The goal was no longer humiliation, it was control. When the first prisoners arrived in 1842, they were mostly petty offenders, thieves, pickpockets, drunks. They were stripped of their clothes, given a number, and assigned a cell. Every day began with the toll of the prison bell. Meals were simple, gruel, bread, or thin soup. Work consisted of silent labor, weaving mats, picking oakum, or sewing mailbags. The strict silence rule was absolute. Speaking could result in flogging or solitary confinement in a dark cell. Yet, beneath this discipline lay another purpose. Pentonville was also a training ground, not just for prisoners, but for the prison system itself. It was designed as a template, the model upon which dozens of other prisons across Britain and the Empire would be built. From India to Australia, the Pentonville style spread, bringing with it this new philosophy of order and isolation. But what's most striking about Pentonville's origins is the moral contradiction at its core. It was built in the name of humanity, to reform rather than destroy, yet it inflicted immense psychological suffering. It claimed to save souls, but it often broke them. The men who walked into Pentonville's gates entered as criminals, but many left as ghosts of themselves. Hollow, withdrawn, permanently scarred by silence, the prison's early records show how harsh the reality became. Within just a few years of operation, inspectors noted cases of insanity, depression, and suicide among inmates. The separate system, while noble in theory, proved unbearable for the human mind. Even prison chaplains began to question whether solitude could truly bring salvation, or whether it was simply another form of cruelty. Still, Pentonville stood as a masterpiece of design and discipline. Its high brick walls, its watchtower, its rigid order, all became symbols of Victorian control. To the outside world, it represented progress. To those inside, it was a tomb of silence. Over time, Pentonville's reputation grew. It was no longer just a prison. It was a statement of power, a warning to anyone who defied the law. Its origins reflected a nation's attempt to balance morality and authority, to civilize punishment while maintaining absolute control. And in that balance, Pentonville became more than a place of confinement. It became a mirror, reflecting the fears, beliefs, and contradictions of an empire at its peak. As the gates of Pentonville swung open in 1842, Britain was witnessing not just the birth of a new prison, but the unveiling of a revolutionary design philosophy. This was not a random collection of bricks and cells. Every corridor, every doorway, every stone in Pentonville's structure was meticulously placed with one purpose in mind: control. The architecture of Pentonville was a statement, an embodiment of power, morality, and surveillance. Its design came from the blueprint of an idea: that order could be engineered. The man behind this architectural revolution was Colonel Joshua Jebb, an officer in the Royal Engineers, who saw prison design not as construction, but as social engineering. Under his vision, Pentonville became the physical manifestation of the Victorian belief in discipline and reform. The prison was laid out in the now iconic Radial design. Imagine standing in a circular hub, the heart of the prison, with 5 long wings spreading out like the spokes of a giant wheel. From the center, guards could observe every corridor, each lined with identical cell doors stretching into the distance. This wasn't by accident. It was inspired by a powerful concept known as Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, the idea that constant visibility could enforce good behavior. A single watchtower, a single pair of unseen eyes, could make hundreds of men obedient without a word. This architectural form turned surveillance into architecture. Prisoners didn't know if they were being watched at any given moment, and that uncertainty was the punishment. The design instilled paranoia, obedience, and fear. Pentonville wasn't merely containing criminals, it was conditioning them. Each of Pentonville's 520 original cells was a study in precision. Narrow, cold, and suffocatingly uniform, they were designed not for comfort, but for reflection. Every cell measured about 13 feet long and 7 feet wide, a brick box of isolation. The tiny arched window, placed high on the wall, was deliberately angled so the prisoner could see the sky, but never the world outside. That single patch of light symbolized both hope and control, freedom visible, but forever out of reach. Inside, the furniture was standardized to the inch. A bed, a table, a stool, and a Bible. Nothing more. The air vents and flues were calculated to prevent even whispered communication between neighboring inmates. Pentonville's designers knew the human mind could find ways to rebel, and they engineered the building to suppress it. The sound design of the prison was another chilling innovation. The walls were so thick, and the corridors so long that voices were absorbed before they could echo. Silence was not just a rule here. It was part of the architecture. It pressed in on the inmates like an invisible weight, amplifying every thought, every fear, every heartbeat. Even the exercise yards reflected this philosophy. Prisoners exercised alone in circular yards, walking silently in endless loops, always separated by high brick partitions, so they could never see or speak to one another. The very ground plan of Pentonville was built to erase connection, to isolate body and mind. Yet, in all this bleakness, there was method. Victorian reformers genuinely believed architecture could cure crime. The symmetry of the building was supposed to represent moral balance. The radiating wings symbolized order radiating from authority, the moral center of society controlling the chaos of sin. Pentonville, in its geometry, was a sermon in stone. From above, the prison looked almost beautiful. Clean lines, perfect order, a mathematical harmony of walls and corridors. But to those inside, that beauty became a cage. Every angle, every door, every sightline reminded the inmate of one truth: you are being watched. Even the chapel, the supposed place of salvation, reflected the obsession with separation. Prisoners were led in silently, masked and cloaked, into small wooden stalls divided by high partitions. They could hear the preacher's voice, but not see a single other face. Redemption was to be found in solitude, salvation in silence. This design philosophy didn't stay within Britain's borders. Pentonville became the prototype for an empire of incarceration. Its layout was copied across the Commonwealth, from Millbank and Wandsworth in London to Changi Prison in Singapore and Port Arthur in Tasmania. The Pentonville Plan became a global export, Britain's architectural symbol of justice and control. But behind the symmetry and innovation lurked a dark irony. The very structure meant to rehabilitate also became a machine for suffering. The isolation wings turned men inward until their minds fractured. Wardens reported inmates staring blankly for hours, muttering prayers to walls, breaking down in tears from the sheer pressure of solitude. Even the staff were affected. Guards patrolled endless corridors lined with identical doors, each containing a life sealed in silence. The building's order was suffocating not just for prisoners, but for everyone inside. Pentonville wasn't simply a place. It was a system, a living mechanism of obedience. When Victorian visitors toured the facility, they called it a marvel of modern discipline. Politicians praised it as humane, scientific, and efficient. But a few reformers saw something else, a monument to human coldness. One observer wrote, "Here, solitude is stretched into punishment. Silence is sharpened into a weapon." The architecture of Pentonville told a story not only of bricks and bars but of philosophy. A philosophy that believed crime could be controlled through design, and the soul could be purified through isolation. It was Britain's grand experiment in moral engineering. A cathedral of punishment built on faith in structure, from the watchtower's central eye to the last cell at the farthest end. Pentonville's architecture whispered one message through the corridors of history: we see you, we control you, and even in your silence you belong to us. Step beyond Pentonville's iron gates, and you enter a world far removed from the bustling streets of Victorian London. Outside, the city thrived. Factories hummed, carriages rattled, and the air carried the scents of coal, bread, and soot. Inside, time seemed to slow, bending to the rhythm of the prison bell. The life of a Pentonville inmate was not measured in days or weeks, but in the endless repetition of silence, labor, and ritual. A life carefully engineered to strip away individuality and forge compliance. From the moment a prisoner entered, he was introduced to a system of total control. Clothes were confiscated, hair cut short, personal belongings removed. Each inmate was assigned a number, replacing his name, a symbolic erasure of identity. Numbers rather than names were etched into prison ledgers and marked on cell doors. To the wardens, these were not men, they were objects to be observed, monitored, and corrected. Daily routines were rigid and exhausting. The day began with the tolling of the prison bell, signaling a march from darkness into light. Although the light was always muted, filtered through high, narrow windows. Prisoners dressed in the same coarse uniform, often in dull shades of gray, and were marched silently to their assigned tasks. Silence was mandatory at all times. Speaking, whispering, or even eye contact could result in punishment, sometimes in solitary confinement within an even smaller, darker cell known as the dark cell. A work was a central part of prison life, not merely to occupy the body, but to discipline the mind. Prisoners were assigned tasks such as oakum picking, unraveling old rope fibers, sewing, or crafting mats and sacks. Labor was silent, monotonous, and physically demanding. The repetitive motions, combined with enforced quiet, created a psychological pressure that tested the boundaries of endurance. Every sound, a cough, a dropped tool, was amplified in the silence, a reminder of isolation. Meals were equally regimented. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner were served in cells or in small individual cubicles. The food itself was simple: gruel, bread, sometimes thin soup. There was no communal dining, no conversation, no shared laughter. Just the echoing clink of utensils on metal plates. Prisoners were encouraged to reflect on their crimes while eating, and inspectors believed that even sustenance could be moral instruction, reinforcing the penitential purpose of incarceration. The prison's exercise routine was perhaps the only time prisoners were allowed outside their cells. Yet even this was carefully controlled. They walked in individual yards, enclosed by high brick walls, in solitary, never allowed to speak to each other. Some yards were circular, designed to reinforce monotony, while others allowed visual surveillance from the central watchtower. Guards patrolled continuously, ensuring that even these brief moments of freedom were tightly regulated. Pentonville was particularly notable for its emphasis on psychological discipline. Inmates were taught that solitude was not merely a punishment but a moral tool, a chance for reflection, repentance, and eventual rehabilitation. To enforce this, prison staff employed an array of psychological methods: constant observation, controlled routines, and rigorous enforcement of rules. Chapel attendance, for instance, involved sitting in wooden stalls separated by partitions. The prisoner could hear the preacher, but not see or interact with anyone else. Salvation was private, reflection was solitary. Yet the strictures of daily life came at a heavy cost. Many prisoners suffered mental and emotional deterioration under the separate system. Records from the Victorian era show frequent cases of anxiety, depression, and hallucinations. Some prisoners muttered to themselves for hours, while others obsessively carved messages into walls, a desperate attempt to assert their existence. There were documented cases of suicide, and prison doctors often reported that inmates' mental health declined rapidly in the first weeks of confinement. The regimentation extended to every detail. Beds were made identically, cells were kept scrupulously clean, tools and materials were accounted for to the inch. Even the lighting was controlled, so prisoners rarely experienced natural daylight. The entire design of daily life, from meals to work, from exercise to sleep, was a symphony of monotony, a constant reinforcement of authority, and the absence of personal freedom. Despite the harshness, some inmates adapted. They learned small ways to cope, humming quietly to themselves, counting steps during exercise, memorizing texts from the Bible, or mentally crafting plans for life beyond the walls. Yet even these small acts were forms of resistance, subtle assertions of individuality, against the crushing uniformity imposed by the prison. The impact on physical health was also significant. Many prisoners suffered from malnutrition, scurvy, or exhaustion due to the combination of hard labor, limited food, and confined space. Disease spread quickly in such confined quarters, though Pentonville was cleaner and more hygienic than older prisons of its time. Still, the psychological strain often magnified physical suffering. Inmates weakened in body as they broke in mind. Life at Pentonville was thus an experiment in human endurance. It was intended to reform, yet it tested the limits of human resilience. Prisoners were forced to confront their sins, their fears, and their isolation in an environment designed to strip them of all social connection. In their daily routines, the philosophy of the separate system became tangible, the slow, grinding process of control that sought to remake the criminal mind. In essence, Pentonville's daily life was a deliberate orchestration of suffering and reflection, a theater in which the human spirit was both the actor and the audience. Every moment, from the toll of the bell to the solitude of the cell, reinforced the prison's dual purpose to punish and to reform. It was a life of endless repetition, a life defined by isolation, silence, and the unyielding gaze of authority, a life that remains both fascinating and horrifying to this day. Within the cold, silent walls of Pentonville Prison, history was written not only in bricks and iron, but in the lives of the men who passed through its gates. While many were ordinary criminals, there were some whose names echoed far beyond the prison walls. Figures whose crimes, cunning, and charisma made them infamous, not just in Britain, but around the world. Pentonville became a stage for the most notorious, a crucible where the bold, the brilliant, and the dangerous collided with a system designed to break them. One of the prison's most famous inmates was Oscar Wilde, the celebrated playwright and wit. Sentenced in 1895 for gross indecency, Wilde entered Pentonville as a man of intellect and charm, only to confront the harsh realities of isolation, labor, and regimented life. His experience exemplified the stark contrast between public fame and private suffering. The prison, designed to strip identity, could not silence Wilde's mind. He endured the punishment of Pentonville while continuing to craft letters, reflections, and the deep observations of human nature that would endure long after his death. Then there was Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen, the American homeopath convicted in 1910 for the murder of his wife. Crippen's crime and trial captured the fascination of the public. A tale of betrayal, secrecy, and sensational headlines. When he arrived at Pentonville, he entered a world designed to neutralize cunning. His days were filled with silent labor, solitary reflection, and regimented routines that stripped him of opportunity to manipulate or charm. Even the most devious minds found their freedom curtailed by the prison's meticulous control. The prison also housed criminal masterminds and gangsters, men who had terrorized London and its suburbs with theft, violence, and intimidation. Figures such as the Kray Twins, notorious for their organized crime in the mid-20th century, found the walls of Pentonville a stark reminder that even power had limits. For these men, accustomed to dominance and influence, the rigid order of the prison was a psychological battlefield. The same walls that confined the petty thief or the failed pickpocket tested the cunning, resilience, and ego of London's most feared criminals. Pentonville's roster included political prisoners and rebels, those who challenged authority not merely with violence but with ideology. Their presence demonstrated that the prison was more than a place for criminals. It was a tool of the state to control dissent. Imprisoned for acts deemed dangerous to society, these individuals faced the same silencing solitude and regimented routines, their political fervor forced into isolation and quiet reflection. In some cases, this solitude became an incubator for planning or writing, showing that even in confinement, human determination could find expression. The notoriety of these prisoners did more than fill Pentonville's cells. It created an aura around the institution itself. Newspapers and pamphlets reported on arrivals and sentences, painting the prison as a fortress not only of law but of infamy. To the public, Pentonville became a symbol of ultimate justice, a place where society's most dangerous or scandalous figures were neutralized. Yet behind the headlines, the daily reality was harsh, silent, and psychologically grueling. Prisoners such as conmen, fraudsters, and poisoners added another layer to Pentonville's reputation. These were individuals whose crimes relied on intellect and deception rather than brute force. For them, the punishment was particularly insidious. The separate system and enforced silence removed their primary tools: persuasion, manipulation, and interaction. Pentonville forced every prisoner into a confrontation with himself, revealing not just guilt but weakness, vulnerability, and human limitation. Among these infamous inmates, the stories of personal resilience and despair are almost legendary. Some prisoners adapted, finding ways to occupy their minds through reading, writing, or meditation. Others succumbed to the pressure, their spirits broken by the combination of solitude, labor, and constant surveillance. The prison became a crucible, testing the boundaries of human endurance and resilience. The famous and the feared alike found themselves subject to the same unyielding systems, demonstrating that no amount of wealth, influence, or cunning could fully insulate one from the reach of Pentonville's design. The presence of notorious prisoners also influenced public perception and policy. Each high-profile case provided insight into the efficacy, or cruelty, of the separate system. Reformers and critics studied their experiences, debating whether Pentonville's methods truly reformed criminals or merely inflicted psychological torment. The prison, in housing the famous and infamous, became a focal point for discussion on justice, morality, and punishment in Victorian and Edwardian Britain. Yet, the notoriety of these prisoners also created unintended mythology. Stories of escapes, attempted rebellion, or quiet defiance spread beyond the prison walls, adding to the aura of Pentonville as a place of both terror and fascination. In some ways, these infamous inmates became ambassadors of the prison's legacy, living proof of its power, influence, and capacity to shape history. In the end, Pentonville's roster of notorious prisoners was a microcosm of Britain itself. A mix of brilliance and brutality, ambition and desperation, intellect and criminality, from Oscar Wilde's literary genius to Dr. Crippen's dark infamy, from the streetwise cunning of gangsters to the moral courage of political rebels. Each prisoner left an indelible mark on the prison's history. Pentonville was more than a building of bricks and bars. It was a theater in which the stories of the infamous unfolded, echoing through time and shaping the perception of justice, crime, and punishment for generations to come. While Pentonville Prison was designed to impose absolute control over its inmates, history shows that human ingenuity, desperation, and defiance often found ways to challenge even the most secure systems. Behind the thick brick walls, and under the unblinking gaze of the central watchtower, some prisoners plotted daring escapes, while others erupted in violent riots that shook the foundations of this model prison. Despite its reputation as a fortress of discipline, Pentonville was not immune to human cunning. Over the decades, several prisoners attempted, and in rare cases succeeded, in escaping the prison's iron grip. These attempts became legendary, often capturing the imagination of the public, highlighting both the limits of the separate system and the relentless drive for freedom that burned in the hearts of men denied it. Some escapes were meticulously planned, taking advantage of small weaknesses in the prison's structure or routine. Prisoners studied guards' movements, noted the timing of patrols, and coordinated subtle diversions. One of the most audacious types of escape involved smuggling tools or even small pieces of metal hidden in clothing, furniture, or bedding, demonstrating ingenuity under extreme duress. These stories revealed that even the rigid architecture of Pentonville, designed for maximum surveillance, could not entirely contain human resourcefulness. But escapes were only part of the story. More frequent and dramatic were prison riots, eruptions of violence born from frustration, overcrowding, and the oppressive isolation of the separate system. Though Pentonville was designed to suppress collective action, prisoners could rarely see or communicate with each other. Tensions sometimes reached a breaking point. Small sparks, such as the denial of privileges, harsh treatment by wardens, or rumors of unfair sentencing, could ignite explosive outbreaks of rebellion. One notable riot occurred when prisoners, long subjected to silent labor and harsh rules, coordinated a brief yet violent revolt in one of the exercise yards. They overturned furniture, set fires, and attempted to breach internal gates. Though the uprising was ultimately quelled by guards reinforced with local police, the event left a mark on the prison's reputation, demonstrating that even the strictest systems could be challenged by collective desperation. These riots and escape attempts were not just physical acts of rebellion, they were also psychological battles. Prisoners resisted the relentless monotony of daily life, asserting their agency in whatever ways they could. Whether it was shouting defiance, attacking guards, or plotting escape, these acts were the human mind's protest against the crushing weight of isolation. Each incident forced Pentonville's administration to adapt, redesign protocols, and rethink the balance between order and humanity. The most notorious escape attempts became part of London folklore. Stories circulated in newspapers of inmates scaling walls with makeshift ropes, concealing themselves in delivery carts, or using inside help from sympathetic guards. Each tale was sensationalized for the public, portraying Pentonville simultaneously as impregnable and vulnerable. A paradox that fascinated society. These incidents reinforced the prison's mystique, showing that behind every brick wall and barred window, there was tension, risk, and the potential for chaos. Riots, in particular, exposed the tension between authority and confinement, guards faced the dangerous reality of suppressing violent outbursts in enclosed spaces, sometimes resorting to force that injured prisoners. Reports of broken furniture, damaged cells, and fires during riots highlighted the fragility of even the most carefully planned prison systems. Each riot forced a reassessment of security measures, from patrol rotations to the design of exercise yards, illustrating the constant battle between prisoner ingenuity and institutional control. Yet, despite these upheavals, the system largely endured. Pentonville's design, the radial wings, central watchtower, and strict routines generally prevented large-scale escapes or prolonged riots. The majority of prisoners, faced with isolation, labor, and surveillance, complied with the system. But the very fact that escape attempts and riots occurred at all speaks to a universal truth: confinement, no matter how well engineered, cannot entirely suppress the human desire for freedom. These stories of rebellion also contributed to Pentonville's legacy in public imagination. Newspaper accounts, sensational novels, and later films depicted daring prisoners plotting under the nose of vigilant guards, giving the prison a reputation not only for discipline but for drama. Each escape attempt or riot became a narrative of tension between ingenuity and authority, courage and control, desperation and law. In essence, Pentonville's history of escapes and riots reveals the dual nature of confinement. On one hand, it is a fortress of surveillance and control, a triumph of architecture and discipline. On the other, it is a stage for human ingenuity, rebellion, and defiance, a reminder that no structure, however imposing, can entirely contain the will to resist. Within these walls, ordinary prisoners became strategists, philosophers of survival, and, in some cases, legends of criminal audacity. Each failed escape or suppressed riot tells a story of tension, human spirit, and the constant negotiation between power and resistance. Pentonville, as much as it symbolizes Victorian control, also embodies the eternal struggle of the human mind against confinement. The struggle between captivity and the yearning for freedom that no brick wall can ever fully erase. Within the imposing walls of Pentonville, life and death often stood side by side. While the prison's architecture and routines were designed to reform, discipline, and confine, the ultimate symbol of authority loomed quietly in the shadows: the gallows. Here, the separate system met its most final judgment, a grim instrument of state power where punishment became permanent and inescapable. Executions at Pentonville were a chilling reminder of the consequences of crime in Victorian Britain. Capital punishment, still legally sanctioned for a range of offenses, was carried out with precision, ritual, and stark efficiency. Unlike the public hangings of earlier centuries, which had been spectacles attended by thousands, Pentonville executions were conducted in private, often witnessed only by prison officials, clergy, and select observers. The move from public to private executions reflected a broader shift in philosophy. Punishment was no longer about spectacle. It was about control, morality, and the ultimate demonstration of authority. The execution chamber itself was designed to evoke fear and reflection. Hidden within the prison, away from the gaze of most prisoners, it was simple, functional, and foreboding. The gallows were prepared meticulously, with ropes checked, floors cleared, and witnesses briefed. Inmates condemned to death were led through silent corridors, their fate made tangible with every step. The atmosphere was tense, oppressive, and absolute, a place where the human mind confronted mortality in its most immediate and undeniable form. The condemned were offered moments of preparation and reflection. Chaplains provided spiritual guidance, allowing prisoners to confess, repent, or seek solace in their final hours. These moments, however brief, reinforced Pentonville's dual philosophy that punishment was not only physical but moral. Death, in the context of the prison, was both retribution and, paradoxically, a final opportunity for spiritual redemption. Famous executions at Pentonville left indelible marks on both the institution and public consciousness. Men convicted of murder, espionage, and other capital crimes met their end in this solemn chamber. Some cases, like that of Dr. Hawley Crippen, drew sensational media attention, turning the execution into a narrative of intrigue, horror, and fascination. Though the act was private, Newspapers often recounted the stories of the condemned in minute detail, amplifying the prison's notoriety. Executions were carried out with meticulous adherence to procedure. Guards, executioners, and officials moved like parts of a well-oiled machine. The condemned were restrained, the noose placed precisely beneath the chin, and the lever released. Death was immediate, or, in some tragic cases, delayed due to error, but always absolute. Witnesses often described the experience as harrowing, a mix of clinical detachment and moral reflection. To those who watched, it was a demonstration of law, order, and the unflinching consequences of crime. The psychological weight of the gallows extended beyond the condemned. Prison staff, chaplains, and fellow inmates all lived under its shadow. Guards patrolled corridors knowing that the next soul to pass through the execution chamber could be one they escorted. Inmates confined to their cells were acutely aware of the fate that awaited those who failed to reform or who committed the most heinous acts. The gallows served as both deterrent and constant reminder of mortality, embedding fear and obedience deep within the prison's atmosphere. Yet, even in this grim environment, the morality of execution was debated. Reformers questioned whether death truly served justice or whether it was an instrument of societal control, a means to demonstrate the power of the state over the individual. Chaplains wrestled with spiritual considerations, attempting to reconcile the administration of lethal punishment with principles of forgiveness and redemption. The presence of the gallows forced everyone in Pentonville, from wardens to inmates, to confront profound questions about crime, morality, and human life. Pentonville's executions were part of a broader legacy of British capital punishment. They reflected a society transitioning from public spectacle to regulated, bureaucratic enforcement of law. The prison itself became a symbol of this evolution, a place where punishment was no longer about shame alone, but about control, order, and the moral framework of a nation. Over time, the gallows became part of Pentonville's dark mythology. Tales of condemned men, their final words, and the precise coldness of their deaths entered the public imagination. The prison was seen as a theater, where life's fragility was displayed, a stage upon which the ultimate consequence of crime was enacted. Even decades later, Pentonville is remembered not just for its architecture, labor systems, or infamous inmates, but for its role in Britain's history of execution, a place where death, law, and morality intersected in the starkest terms. In essence, the executions and the gallows were more than acts of punishment. They were a manifestation of power, authority, and human consequence. They exemplified the Victorian ideal of discipline, not just over the body, but over society itself, and left an indelible mark on the legacy of Pentonville Prison, haunting the corridors of history long after the nooses were removed. Pentonville Prison has stood for nearly 2 centuries, a sentinel of Britain's evolving justice system. While its early history is steeped in the rigid discipline, isolation, and notorious executions of the Victorian era, the modern Pentonville tells a story of transformation, adaptation, and continuity. It is no longer merely a fortress of moral engineering. It is a working institution reflecting contemporary debates about crime, punishment, and rehabilitation. Today, Pentonville functions primarily as a remand prison, housing individuals awaiting trial or sentencing. It also accommodates short-term inmates, blending historical infrastructure with modern penal practices. From the outside, its high brick walls and watchtowers retain the imposing presence of the past, but the interior has evolved to meet contemporary standards of safety, security, and prisoner welfare. CCTV cameras, updated cell locks, medical facilities, and educational spaces now coexist with the echoes of history, creating a complex tapestry of old and new. The modern transformation of Pentonville reflects broader changes in prison philosophy. Whereas the separate system once sought to isolate and psychologically discipline inmates, today's approaches emphasize rehabilitation, mental health support, and reintegration into society. Educational programs, vocational training, and counseling aim to reduce reoffending rates and provide prisoners with tools for life beyond the walls. Workshops in literacy, numeracy, and vocational skills operate alongside traditional labor, and mental health professionals provide therapy and guidance. a stark contrast to the austere and punitive routines of the 19th century. However, the prison has not been without challenges. Overcrowding, staffing shortages, and mental health crises have tested Pentonville in recent decades. Reports of self-harm, assaults, and unrest among inmates highlight the ongoing struggle to balance security, welfare, and rehabilitation. These issues underscore that, despite modern adaptations, the core tension of incarceration remains. The need to confine, control, and protect society while acknowledging the humanity of those imprisoned. Pentonville's historical architecture has also shaped its modern identity. The radial wings and central watchtower, while iconic, were designed for an era of strict surveillance and isolation. Adapting such a structure to contemporary needs has required ingenuity renovations, repurposed spaces, and careful management preserve the historical character while allowing for modern operations. The prison itself is a living museum, where the physical environment carries stories of the past even as inmates navigate the present. The prison's cultural significance has grown in the modern era. It is frequently referenced in documentaries, books, and news stories, symbolizing both Britain's penal history and the ongoing evolution of justice. Tours for officials, journalists, and occasionally the public reveal the tension between the grim legacy of Victorian punishment and the modern emphasis on rehabilitation. Pentonville is no longer just a site of fear and authority. It is also a site of reflection, historical understanding, and social critique. Modern-day Pentonville also represents a microcosm of societal issues. The mix of inmates, from first-time offenders to repeat criminals, reflects broader questions about poverty, inequality, substance abuse, and social support systems. Programs in the prison are designed not merely to punish, but to address the root causes of crime, offering insights into how society can prevent incarceration before it becomes necessary. In this way, Pentonville has evolved from a static institution of discipline to a dynamic environment aimed at change, growth, and accountability. Yet, the shadow of history remains. Prisoners walk the same corridors that once witnessed executions, and the anguish of solitary confinement. Guards patrol the same wings that housed notorious criminals like Dr. Crippen or Oscar Wilde. Every brick, every barred window, every echoing cell door carries the weight of memory. Modern practices coexist with historical resonance, creating a unique environment where past and present meet. The transformation of Pentonville also highlights the evolution of public perception. Once regarded purely as a symbol of strict punishment and moral engineering, it is now part of broader discussions about criminal justice reform. How should society treat offenders? What balance should exist between punishment and rehabilitation? How can prisons address mental health and prevent reoffending? Pentonville serves as both a case study and a cautionary tale, showing how centuries-old institutions must adapt to the complexities of modern life. In essence, the modern-day Pentonville is a living paradox, a historic institution that remains operational, blending tradition with innovation. It preserves the architectural and psychological legacies of the past, while embracing contemporary values of safety, rehabilitation, and human dignity. Its walls still echo with stories of infamy, courage, and suffering, but within those echoes, new narratives are being written. Narratives of hope, reform, and the ongoing quest to balance justice with humanity. Pentonville Prison is more than bricks, bars, and a legacy of punishment. It is a living symbol of Britain's evolving relationship with law, justice, and human behavior. Its influence stretches far beyond the North London site, permeating literature, film, social policy, and collective imagination. To understand Pentonville's legacy is to understand the tension between human resilience and the machinery of authority. The delicate balance between punishment, reform, and cultural memory. The very design of Pentonville became a template for prisons worldwide. Its radial layout, centralized watchtower, and separate system inspired prison architects across the British Empire, from Australia to India and beyond. Colonial authorities adopted the principles of surveillance, isolation, and psychological control to manage vast populations, applying Victorian ideals of discipline on a global scale. Pentonville's architectural philosophy was exported as a model of moral engineering, leaving a tangible mark on prison systems around the world. Culturally, Pentonville became synonymous with notoriety and intrigue. Stories of its infamous prisoners, Oscar Wilde, Dr. Crippen, the Kray Twins, circulated widely, capturing public imagination. Novels, plays, and newspapers immortalized their experiences, blending fact and legend. The prison became a backdrop for human drama, tales of courage, cunning, despair, and survival intertwined with the rigid routines and cold architecture of the institution. In doing so, Pentonville transformed from a mere site of incarceration into a narrative stage where societal values, morality, and justice were dramatized. Film and television further amplified its cultural footprint. Documentaries and dramatizations have explored Pentonville's history, focusing on escapes, riots, and executions, presenting it as a symbol of both fear and fascination. Its walls have inspired countless stories about crime, punishment, and redemption, embedding the prison into the public consciousness as a site of historical intrigue and moral reflection. The imagery of Pentonville, the radial wings, the shadowed corridors, the silent cells, has become emblematic of imprisonment itself, a visual shorthand for confinement, and authority in popular media. Pentonville's legacy is also intellectual and philosophical. The debates it sparked about punishment versus rehabilitation, the morality of solitary confinement, and the ethics of capital punishment continue to resonate in modern criminal justice discourse. Reformers, historians, and policymakers have studied its separate system to understand the psychological effects of isolation, the potential for reform, and the limitations of purely punitive approaches. Pentonville serves as a historical case study, a lens through which society examines its own evolving values and principles regarding crime and justice. The prison's influence on mental health awareness is particularly notable. Victorian-era observations of the psychological toll of isolation informed subsequent penal reforms, influencing both policy and theory. The recognition that extreme solitary confinement could lead to mental breakdowns contributed to modern understandings of humane treatment and prisoner rehabilitation. In this way, Pentonville's dark past has informed contemporary debates on ethical incarceration and the responsibilities of the state toward those it confines. Pentonville also occupies a place in popular imagination and metaphor. Its name has become shorthand for discipline, confinement, and control, evoked in literature, journalism, and conversation as a symbol of strict order and harsh consequences. Even today, references to Pentonville evoke a sense of dread and fascination, blending historical fact with collective myth. Its cultural impact is enduring because it reflects universal themes: authority versus freedom, punishment versus reform, fear versus resilience. Beyond literature and media, Pentonville's legacy extends to modern penal philosophy. By examining its successes and failures, contemporary prison reformers gain insight into balancing security, rehabilitation, and human dignity. The prison's long history allows society to reflect on how justice can be administered effectively without dehumanizing those under its control. Its lessons are both cautionary and instructive, guiding debates on overcrowding, prisoner welfare, and the ethical use of confinement in the modern era. In essence, Pentonville Prison is more than a building or an institution. It is a living symbol of history, society, and human complexity. Its legacy is layered: architectural, cultural, ethical, and psychological. It reminds us that prisons are not merely places of confinement, but arenas where human behavior, societal values, and moral questions intersect. The stories of its prisoners, the echoes of its riots and executions, and the philosophical debates it inspired continue to resonate, demonstrating that Pentonville is not just a historical site. It is a mirror of humanity itself. From its inception as a model of the separate system to its role as a modern remand prison, Pentonville has left an indelible mark on British history and global penal practices. Its walls tell stories of suffering and resilience. Its corridors whisper tales of fear and defiance, and its very existence challenges society to confront the eternal questions: what is justice? How should we punish? And how do we reconcile authority with humanity? Pentonville's legacy endures because it is more than the sum of its bricks and bars. It is a story of innovation and cruelty, reform and oppression, despair and resilience, a story that continues to shape how we understand crime, punishment, and the human spirit.